Class, MASH. By Anutty. Chapter 71, Fairness. Placing his hand over the familiar knob of the training room door, MASH gave it a slight push. It didn't open but didn't feel locked either. It almost felt like something was propped up against the inside. Thinking it was something set up by Jack, MASH put more weight behind his push and managed to force the door open. It creaked under the weight, and he saw what was behind it. Several of the training dummies were lined up in front of the door, but he did see that Jack was sitting inside. Jack was wearing his usual get-up, but he felt more dangerous for some reason. It was like a small change in his aura. Though once he recognized them, the aura died away, leaving him as his usual casual self. "Wasn't sure you were going to make it, and I needed to do something to keep the vermin out." Jack waved at them to enter, speaking casually about the blockade he had made. Since he didn't comment on the aura from earlier, MASH chose not to either and asked about something else. "What do you mean?" Despite knowing that it was the obvious question, MASH still asked, a little confused by the situation. "Several people had been trying to get a meeting with our little monster. A fitting title for you, might I add." It took MASH a second to process the words, somewhat stunned by his new title. The monster part was obvious enough and was indeed fitting, but little was not. Where did that even come from? He was above average height, especially if you considered his age. "It's your age. You're our precious baby monster." Jill spoke jokingly, though MASH did not find it amusing. She had read his confusion and given him the real answer mixed with her humor. He found that he was slowly getting used to her jokes, even finding it somewhat relaxing. It was his age that influenced his nickname, and he hoped that it would change once he grew up. However, some part of him knew that these kinds of names stuck. Well, it could be worse, it could have been Baby Monster, like Jill's joke. That was not something he would accept. His friends found it amusing though, and it was another thing that Luna would tease him about. "What about the other thing?" Jack said. "Wait, people came to see me." "Yeah, a few adventurers wanting to become monster slayers. The other was a plethora of teams trying to scoop you up and rescue you from weak teammates." Jack laid the sarcasm on thickly, making an exaggerated gesture with his hands as he enunciated the word weak. MASH started laughing, watching his friends grow angry at the words. "Fools, don't they know that my team is hopeless without me? I must stay with them, lest they find themselves dead." Returning Jack's sarcasm with his own, MASH took jabs at his friends' expense. A little revenge for the amusement they got from the scene earlier. It looked like Red was about to come up with a retort but was stopped by Jack. "You guys can talk later, for now, let's get on to training. I got something fun planned for today. All three of you have fights tomorrow after all." He spoke, calling Luke up to go first. Seeming a little anxious, Luke made his way to the area Jack designated. Once he stepped towards the center of the area, a monster appeared from his right, pouncing on Luke where he stood. Despite the suddenness, Luke had been prepared, one of his hands growing large enough to catch the creature. As his buffs flared to life, Luke broke the thing's neck. The snap was audible throughout the training grounds. He wasn't given the opportunity to rest either, another monster forming in thin air. When it happened this time, it was within MASH's mana territory, and he could see what was happening. It was Jack's mana that slowly seemed to form an illusion. Well, it started as a simple illusion, but then he saw it get infused with more mana and couldn't understand what was happening. Priscilla did though and recognized the magic. She called it creation magic, but that could mean anything to him. When he tried to ask for more specifics, she simply repeated the claim. He was turning illusions into solid creations. Few creatures can develop that skill, and almost none can emulate it. Priscilla had no talent for it, but that might change depending on his talent with it. The next fight had a wider variety of monsters, each of which performed different attacks. It seemed like Jack could do whatever he wanted, each creature was using a different element. At one point, he created a lizard thing that shot a type of viscous goo, and MASH thought that a creature like that wasn't real. The diversity of monsters made him eager for his turn. It took a while for Luke to lose, having been able to withstand several attacks and healing himself constantly. He had the best healing abilities among the group and could withstand near-fatal wounds. Eventually, he ran out of mana and had to stop. MASH realized that most of Luke's fights would look gruesome, even if he was mostly unharmed at the end of it. MASH got to go next and walked up to the stage eagerly. The first monster formed behind him, though he was easily able to cut it apart with a wooden blade. He didn't have any blind spots at this range and would notice each time a monster formed. As the next two formed, he immediately cut them down before they could attack. Noticing 3 more monsters starting to form, he prepared an attack with Priscilla, but the monsters never formed. Jack stopped upon hearing Luke's words. You have to make them further back, at least 15 feet. Otherwise, he can sense them. It was surprising to hear Luke be the one to out his skill. He probably wanted Mash to struggle more since he had trouble dealing with the monsters. Jack easily adjusted to Luke's words, and the next monsters did appear out of his range. All of them were lizards, and Mash saw that they were covered in different color scales. The first fired an orb of fire at him, and he managed to dodge that one easily. The problem was the one that shot a narrow bolt of lightning. Despite seeing the thing prime the attack, it was too fast to dodge and hit him in the side. Mash was a bit surprised to see that it didn't do much damage. Priscilla explained that his lightning affinity was protecting him a little, though it wouldn't do much for stronger attacks. Glancing at Jack, Mash saw the confusion in his eyes. He had probably expected that to do more damage. Now that he knew what the most dangerous type of monster was, he made sure to attack those as soon as he recognized it. Mash had debated on whether he wanted to use his lightning abilities here or not, but decided against it. The guild didn't feel like it would be particularly good at hiding his power. Especially, considering how it was trying to flaunt him about like its prized pet. Even without his lightning, the monster fights forced him to pay attention and adapt. As Jack had claimed, the training had been fun. There was a simple pleasure to fighting, and the diversity of the monsters kept him thinking. Mash kept going even after his persist skill was triggered. Jack was inexhaustible though and continued to increase the difficulty until Mash lost. Eventually, he was overwhelmed by the monsters, one too many attacks landing. Mash collapsed as soon as he was made to stop, and he was moved to the outer rings. He didn't fall unconscious this time and hoped that it would become a usual thing. Losing consciousness had been annoying. He doubted that would change though. This reaction was probably just because he didn't overdo it too much. Persist had activated but only for a few minutes. He needed to run more specific tests of the skill, but it was a highly annoying skill to analyze. He was propped up against the walls, glad to be able to see the remaining fights. Mash was a bit surprised to see Red get the furthest. Her magic and healing capabilities let her deal a lot of damage while shrugging off most wounds. It didn't take long for her to surpass the rest of them. Once they were done with training, Jack gave them ample time to rest. Though he wasn't done with them just yet. He lectured them on various types of monsters, as well as how to best handle unusual circumstances. It was a short lecture but felt very thorough. As he came to the end of his discussion, he brought up the tournament. Sounding hopeful, he asked the group about what their plans were. So, who's going to fight this weekend? Just Mash. Red replied flatly and curtly. It sounded a little cruel, but it got the idea across that it wasn't up for debate. Clearly unsatisfied with the response, Jack pressed them for more information. Why? Based on our experiences, if we join, we will somehow wind up fighting one another in the first round. I would bet on it. Without a hint of humor, Jill responded to the question. It might have sounded like a joke to someone else, but everyone present knew that it was not a joke. They had come to this decision before, and none of them believed otherwise. Jack probably felt the attitude in the room and gave them an awkward reply before leaving. It seemed that Jack was good with awkward situations, having done something similar before. Well, Mash guessed that no one was particularly good with awkward situations. Soon after Jack left, the others quickly left the room. Having forgotten about the crowd from before, Mash was a little startled to return to the ever-present whispers. It seemed louder now, and more open too. Taking advantage of the mask hiding his eyes, he looked around for the most vocal of the bunch. The person from before wasn't here, but he found the loudmouth easily. With very distinct blue hair, Mash could easily single the person out. The man had water flowing around his shoulders, and Mash figured his class was like Red's. Still tempted to give him a challenge, Mash compared his strength with Red's. It was clear that he was at least one rank above them, and the people at his table were similarly ranked. Knowing that it was a fight he couldn't handle, he restrained his reaction, instead, remembering their faces for any future encounters. Growing tired of dealing with this crowd, Mash tried to push his way to the exit but was interrupted by several people. There were people trying to recruit him as Jack mentioned, but it seemed to be more about his siblings than his own display. He received a never-ending stream of questions about them and started ignoring the recruiter as soon as it started. A few people had been brazen enough to mention how they thought that his team was too weak for him, despite them standing right next to him. Mash didn't give those people the time of day, and his friends gave them the appropriate number of glares. Though he bet that these people would be singing a different tune after tomorrow. Jill's space magic would make a pretty big splash since true spatial mages were so rare and useful. Leaving the guild, Mash and the others picked up their pace. They knew that the whispers would be especially bad now but would die down soon enough. Although, he was planning on using the attention a little more, certain that it would get the fight organizers to raise the stakes. He was growing more excited for his fights tomorrow. Chapter 72, The Coliseum's Plan. Mash was sitting in the stadium. He had received a special room this time, courtesy of his siblings also being present. They had arrived fairly early, but the stadium was already full, several thousand people adorning the seats. A lot more people were present this time around, and he guessed that might have something to do with his second fight being today. Either that or another famous fighter might be having a fight today. Mash didn't pay much attention to the schedule, only learning when his friends were scheduled to fight. He didn't have to worry about his since it was the last one of the day. Luke was fighting first. The organizers probably assumed his fight was the mildest among their group and gave him the third fight of the day. Apparently, Luke had prepared something for today and left early in the morning. Red seemed to know, wearing a smug grin as she waited for his turn. Luna and Jill were probing her for the information, trying to pry out whatever they could. Keeping her mouth shut, she told them to just watch the fight. So, Mash did exactly that, watching the fight below him come to an end. It was a girl fighting, who was abnormally short. Not a dwarf, that much was obvious by her slender stature, but maybe a half. Despite likely being several years older, she was over 2 heads shorter than Mash. She had long black hair that dragged against the ground and swirled around her for attacks and defense. It was impressive considering she didn't have a directly combat-related class. The announcer had enthusiastically introduced her as a hairstylist, her class likely related to that profession. Directly offensive skills were rare among non-combat classes, and she would likely never get the option for one. It didn't seem to matter though, as she was able to hold hundreds of different weapons with her hair. Even as monsters tried to get past her defenses, they were stopped, either by losing their footing as they tried stepping over the hair or by getting otherwise impaired by the hair. The second method was gruesome, as hair invaded the eyes, ears, noses, and mouths of the various monsters. He gagged whenever he saw a monster die from choking on hair, considering it one of the most unpleasant ways to die. The monsters were rather generic for the fight, mostly just sturdy bodies that usually tore into their opponents with raw strength. Though it seemed ineffective as she neutralized almost every attack. The ones that did hit, seemed to do no damage either, and he couldn't understand why. Priscilla said it had to do with the way the hair bent but decided he would ask the lady later. It wouldn't be hard considering she was wearing a shop's symbol on her shirt. It was largely visible throughout the fight. It was amusing to see that she was taking advantage of the bigger crowd that showed up today. Well, the tactic worked on him, so why not? Her fight ended shortly with over 6 monsters lying dead at her feet. She was completely uninjured as she strolled back to the moving platform. As she did so, her hair fell apart, leaving it beautifully styled as she descended from the arena. That last scene had been more striking than the rest of her fight. Before the next fight started, Luke's fight, the announcer started off on a long preamble for it. The next fight is a special one. A class so rare and dangerous that the number of people to have possessed it could be counted on my 2 hands. A necromancer is one of the few mages who have dared to tamper with the soul. The announcer paused after that, letting the audience get riled up. Feeling the blood drain from his face, Mash nervously looked toward Red. He grew more worried as he saw her looking anxious as well. Growing increasingly scared, Mash had to wonder what was Luke thinking? But this next fighter is one opposed to those monsters. He who similarly touches the souls of men, but for a different purpose. One of the only classes known to oppose necromancy. We have verified it earlier today, but I am glad to introduce the very first soul cleric. Luke rose from the stadium, in a very distinct get-up. It was a traditional outfit that a priest might wear, but it was heavily accented for battle. It was a mix of black and gold. It shone with golden light, his buffs illuminating it further. Even taking his race into consideration, the silence of the crowd was unnatural. They were still unsure, waiting for verification for themselves, and the monsters he faced would reveal the truth. There were only 2, and he wondered how they even managed to capture them. Zombies were rare and only found on the desecrated islands of the West. The last necromancer had raised the ground there, turning it into a domain for the undead. Some people believed the necromancer lived, having evolved into a lich and claiming the island as his domain. This was the test though, and depending on how Luke handled the fight, it would determine the reception he received. Luke seemed confident though, and the announcer gave no other signals. Maybe Luke had given them a demonstration already, and he knew what would happen. At least, Mash hoped that Luke knew what he was doing. He did look confident as he walked towards the zombies. Undead monsters were slow and weak, but a single hit was all it took to end the fight. Even the smallest scratch would send someone down the path of turning into an undead. High-level healers could heal someone before they turned, but there was a narrow window of time for that. So, Mash couldn't help but be anxious as the first zombie bit onto Luke. Both zombies were humanoid, though Mash couldn't discern their race easily. It seemed fine though, Luke didn't look the least bit bothered, and there were no signs of spread. Though, maybe that was only something that happened in stories. Mash's eyes grew wide as Luke began to retaliate. He didn't move or attack the creatures, instead, it seemed like he was undoing the transformation. The zombies' goopy and rotting flesh healed, and their skin regained its luster. As Luke finished, what lay on the ground before him were two undamaged human bodies, but somehow Mash could tell that they were dead. Not undead like before, but truly dead. Seeming to continue the performance, he seemed to bless the corpses with a prayer, before heading towards the exit. A few people came out from behind one of the gates and carted off the now identifiable bodies. Luke's descent from the arena was met with silence, but it had a different air about it this time. Instead of hesitation and weariness, the silence was made from awe, admiration, and reverence. In this fight, Luke had introduced himself as one of the only people who could truly save someone after they became undead. Mash was sure that there were others, but they would be even more rare than necromancers themselves. Now, Mash was worried that Luke would be taken away and protected, even more so than his sister. Their party was becoming famous, but the question arose, how would they keep the fame and their freedom? They would need to figure that out, but that could wait until after the fallout of today. A lot would change about their situation, and very quickly. He might as well see where the pieces lie, before trying to build something from them. Red was the next of them to fight, but there were still 4 fights before her turn. Luke arrived shortly, and Mash watched as part of the crowd followed his movements. As Luke entered their private room, he shut the door behind him and slid down against it. Nobody could see him there, but Mash could still people trying to look in through their window. Luke looked exhausted and was breathing slowly. Slowly he looked up and met Mash's eyes before speaking. How do you deal with that feeling? Mash knew what he was talking about, but also knew that it was different. What Mash received, and what Luke did were entirely different. I couldn't tell you. I get fear, you get a whole lot else. That's something you are going to have to figure out. Despite his words, Mash did turn his head to signal Luna. He might have done it more subtly if he wasn't wearing his mask but decided against it. As Luke made his way here, Mash realized that he was in a similar position to Luna now. I choose to ignore them unless they need help. Then I help them and ignore them afterward. Luna sounded surprisingly happy to share her methodology with Luke, and she completely ignored the shake of Alex's head behind her. Mash had gotten used to the paladin's presence, as she followed Luna like a second shadow. Luna could get her to wait outside at times, but Alex claimed that this place was to the public for that. I guess I can try that. Luke's words seemed to be swallowed by a soft chuckle. Mash wanted to feel bad for him but instead found himself feeling a little jealous. The looks of admiration and awe that followed Luke would never follow Mash. Nobody would ever see Mash as a hero or savior, and he knew that. Mash quashed his jealousy, trying to focus on the next fights instead. Though they were woefully uninteresting compared to the display that Luke put on. How do I make things interesting again? Red sounded a little hopeless as the fight below came to an end. It was probably the worst received fight of the day, despite the fighter being unique and powerful. Nobody seemed to care in the slightest after Luke's display. Unable to come up with anything, Mash just shook his head sadly. I don't know, maybe get naked or something. Saying the words easily, Jill looked over the group before laughing loudly. It was clear she was laughing at them, and everyone gave her a vindictive stare. Mash's embarrassment at the suggestion was only partially hidden by the mask, but everyone else was visible to even him. Red looked furious, growing increasingly more like her namesake. She looked about ready to hit Jill, before stopping and turning to glare at him too. Mash had started laughing a bit and tried smothering it without much success. She looked ready to fight him too but stopped and headed out the door. She seemed a little shaken, and he looked behind him towards the arena below. The next fight had ended already, and he realized he missed the announcer's words in their entirety. He missed the fight completely. The adventurer's corpse was the only indication that the fight had even happened. Mash wished he saw how the person had died but reconsidered. It didn't sound or look like it had been much of a fight. The adventurer probably died quickly. All that remained of him or her, he couldn't tell anymore as the head was missing from the person. Rather than being eaten, it looked like it had been smashed by some blunt force, a plethora of viscera lying behind the corpse. It was cleaned quickly, several people coming from behind one of the gates to clean the carnage. Mash didn't pay much attention to the cleaners last time and stopped when he saw the dead look in their eyes. It had all been cleaned quickly, and by the time the next fighter rose to the ground, the arena looked good as new. This was the last fight before Red's show, and he watched with only a small amount of interest at first. His attitude did change when the man used lightning magic. He was a full rank above Mash, and he was excited to learn what he could. The man's fight ended quickly, fast enough that the organizers of the fight took a different approach for this match. Monsters had come out in waves. The first batch was a species of shelled things that were highly resistant to magic. They were reddish, and walked in a silly manner, waddling sideways instead of forward. Mash thought it would be a problem when the man's first wide-ranged attack didn't seem to accomplish much. However, Mash was quickly shown otherwise, as the man's next attack was more like a single bolt, and the resounding thunder shook the entire building. This attack had punched through several of the monsters, killing them in a line. It looked like the fight would be easy for the adventurer moving forward, but the second wave of monsters reminded the audience of the danger. It was a single spiny creature that slithered across the ground like a snake. It launched a spike at the unaware man, and it punched through his neck. It was clear that the man was going to die, and he lashed out with powerful attacks to try and kill the remaining monsters. To his credit, he did succeed in killing most of the monsters but died clutching his neck. He simply fell to the ground, the light shows from his magic dying with him. 2 deaths back to back felt ominous to Mash, and he grew a little more anxious for Red's fight. Chapter 73, Unfair Fights. Mash waited for the announcer to give Red her introduction, but it never came. It seemed like Red had some kind of plan prepared, either that or the announcer forgot what to say. Mash actually found himself hoping for the latter, as it would be an endless stream of humor for them. He watched the rising platform carefully, waiting to see what Red had prepared. They had discussed what each of them could do to cause a commotion, letting it become game to see if anyone could surpass Mash's entrance from 2 days ago. Luke might have him beat, but it was close. Despite what Red had said earlier, she would have had a plan too. However, Mash didn't know what she could do to compete with Luke or him. As Mash saw her rise to the stadium, the crowd gave a very different reaction. The crowd had been somewhat dull for the past few fights and was subdued until this very moment. An eruption of discontent, of insults and death threats, flew from the audience, a violent cacophony of noise. It was the opposite of the silence that Luke made, and even different than what Mash had caused. More than fear or anger, Mash saw hate among the faces of the crowd. As he watched Red rise to the stadium, he realized that she was holding up a symbol of her house, of her family crest. The Venfer family symbol was recognizable anywhere and was always met by either fear or hatred. The coiled whip drenched in blood laid over top a pure white background on Red's flag, and Mash watched as lit the thing on fire. She started on the bottom, and let the fire grow to consume the entirety of the symbol. The gesture was obvious, the meaning not missed by any of the reasonably intelligent among the audience. The loud noises slowly died down, as the people learned of what the gesture meant. On top of denouncing her family name, it was practically a declaration of war against them as well. At the very least, the gesture would mark Red as their enemy, and Mash really hoped she thought this through. He thought that he didn't like surprises very much and made a mental to never do something like this again. It was fun when he did it, sure, but when he could only watch as chaos ensued around him, it was less enjoyable. Especially considering the length his friends were willing to go to. He always figured that he was the craziest or most problematic of the bunch, but that didn't seem so obvious anymore. Mash's attention was caught up by Red's actions that he barely heard the announcers start to speak. Our challenger faces a golem of level 47, a creature that lacks even the tiniest vestiges of blood. A hulking war machine, used to destroy walls and gates. How will one who betrayed even the betrayers fare against such a monster? The announcer's enthusiasm did get a reaction out of the crowd, though it was mixed. And for every insult Mash could make out, there was another cheer in support of her. It was a strange combination, that made the audience seem like they were fighting as well. The aforementioned golem was easily bigger than a house, towering over Mash's creation from the other day. Entirely of stone with silver engravings along the entire surface of the creature. Light emanated from those engravings but shone most brightly from two blue jewels that were placed as eyes. The thing possessed a mostly humanoid shape, though it had an extra set of arms, and lacked a neck. Instead, it just had a dome-shaped head that rested directly on top of its shoulders. It was not a living being, and he didn't really know how to deal damage to it with something like blood. What would Red do? The question passed through his mind, and he sent it towards Priscilla while speaking it aloud for the group. Priscilla replied with no real answer but suggested that she would be fine. Her family must have prepared her to fight creatures without blood. Otherwise, they would have been killed off long ago. That logic made sense, and he refocused on the fight below. From the corner of his eye, he noticed Jill open her mouth to speak but stop as the fight began. Red's blood dress quickly formed around her, and she dashed towards the enormous golem. She held the blood seed in her hand and was pouring mana into it to increase the amount of blood it produced. It poured out like a steady stream and coalesced into an enormous greatsword. Despite being far larger than her body, it was basically just a dagger to the large golem. The blood slammed into the stone with a splash but did nothing to the creature. Not even a scratch was present as she pulled the sword away. It never stopped growing, even as the golem swung at her. It was slow relative to its size, but its size made it faster than Red could dodge. Though she did manage to parry the blow, using the great sword to deflect the strike slightly. Despite succeeding, she was sent flying by the residual force and tumbled across the ground. Rising to her feet in a fluid motion, she never stopped adding blood to her weapon. Now, the weapon would be like a sword to the golem. However, Red didn't leave it as a sword, and as the golem stumbled its way over to her, she changed the sword into a hammer. It only took a few seconds for the process, but the golem was already upon her. This time she managed to dodge the golem's swing and retaliate with her own. She dodged its swing by spinning in a circle like Mash might have and used the spin to swing her hammer against the golem's left leg. Well, it was more of a stump than a proper leg, but the strike still landed against where a knee would normally be. The amount of blood that splashed from the attack drenched the golem's entire leg in blood and even managed to make some cracks across its leg. It didn't break though, and it swung with its right arm. It was faster this time, apparently growing more agitated from the damage. Mash gave an idle thought to wonder how golems could grow angry but stopped when the swing connected. It landed against Red's side. Mash expected to hear a sickening crunch, and Jill stood up like she was going to teleport in. However, she stopped when they realized that the golem's swing had been neutralized. Her dress of blood had moved to one side of her body, thickening significantly to stop the blow. It obviously didn't manage to stop it completely, but it had done much to disperse the force. There was a violent splash at the impact, and Red was sent rolling again, but she got up quickly indicating that there was no serious damage. All the while she never stopped enlarging her weapon. If she runs out mana, get ready to teleport her out. I will handle the fallout. Arthur gave the command in a militaristic style. Jill nodded her head, but never took her eyes off the battlefield. This was something Mash could ignore, but he had been worried about Red burning through her mana as well. If she ran out then the fight was over, and nothing could change that. Mash didn't know what the consequences would be if Jill saved her, but it didn't matter to any of them. Red's hammer was enormous now, easily large enough to damage to the golem, but Mash didn't think that it would beat the creature. She didn't swing it though. Instead, the blood poured back towards her, suffusing her dress until it formed into a colossal visage of herself. Her blood now reached the shoulders of the golem, and she charged towards the monster, tackling it and using her better footwork to topple the creature on its back. The ground shook when it slammed against the ground, but Red didn't stop there, quickly using her enormous size to stomp on the golem's arms and legs. They didn't break in a single hit, but she danced on top of the golem, constantly pounding away at the creature's joints. It was a mesmerizing and fluid motion, that was made more magnificent by the sheer size of her creation. The fight wasn't a grand display of overwhelming power like his or a unique ability like Luke's, but a simple and exciting fight that riled up the audience. The dance only lasted a few moments, but the golem's arms and legs were destroyed. After which Red jumped away from the creature as she ran out of mana. The blood collapsed around her, pouring like a river around her. She was left lying on the ground, and slowly started to recover her mana. She started meditating, much to the horror of the audience. The fight had been exciting, and the audience had grown loud when the two colossuses clashed, but now they were left with nothing. Red was able to mediate peacefully, the golem unable to move an inch without its arms and legs. The monster was recovering too, the arms and legs slowly rebuilding themselves, but it was clear that it would take several hours for a creature of that size. So everyone started yelling for Red to finish the fight, the announcer throwing in a few jeers herself. She ignored them though, spending almost half an hour in meditation. Only after she was finished did she move to finish the golem off. She formed a pickaxe of blood and started hacking away at the creature's chest. Eventually, the core of the thing was exposed, and she was able to finish it off easily. The whole fight took over an hour, and the audience was not very pleased by the end of it. Opposite to the reaction of the audience, Mash and the others were celebrating and laughing as Red struggled to pick apart the golem's remains. It had been ridiculous compared to the display of power from earlier. Jill's fight was soon so she had left by the time Red returned to their room. The crowd didn't seem particularly angry or hateful as she made her way to the room, most seeming to give her a compliment. After all, the fight had been exciting to watch, even if the ending was not particularly dramatic. Rather than fancy tricks or skills, she had overpowered the golem with raw force, which was unnecessary but highly enjoyable to watch. As she entered the room, Red quickly moved towards the couch that she and Jill had been sitting on so far. The room was large, with a large window from which they could see the entire arena. Inside the room, there were several comfortable couches, and even a dining table to eat at. It hung over the audience, but there were smaller windows along the sides for them to look over the crowd. Red sat down at first but fell to the side until she was lying down on the couch. That was exhausting. Letting go of her tension, she spoke while sinking further into the couch. Since Jill wasn't there, Mash took it upon himself to make a snide remark. "Half an hour of meditation not enough for you, princess. It's called mental exhaustion. Not all of us have a freakish meditation skill meant for monsters." Quick with her reply, Mash figured that she was not as tired as she let on. She wore a big smile on her face, clearly happy with how the fight went, and happily waited for Jill's fight to start. It didn't seem like she had any intention to watch the next fight, and neither did Mash for that matter. Red's fight had been stressful and was clearly designed to counter her abilities. He was worried to see what Jill was up against and only glanced at the next fight. It was somebody wearing full plate armor, hiding their entire body completely. Mash didn't care much for it but stopped when he saw the person summon his weapon. The sword was intricately designed and recognizable to everyone in the audience. The weapon of a hero. Chapter 74, Overshadowed. The man or woman, Mash couldn't tell with the armor, walked off the rising platform even before the creature was released. Raising their sword into the air and letting a seemingly endless stream of fire launch into the air. It was as thick as a small building, and the heat was warping the air around it. Mash was surprised to be unable to feel the heat and figured the wielder had a high amount of control of the weapon. Even without the display of power, the weapon was easily recognizable. The announcer's words only confirmed what Mash already knew. The legendary Sword of Flame, of a hero who delivered freedom to all people of the land. The Sword of Devastation, Melsant. Its new wielder, known as the Forger. Once a blacksmith and metal mage, they have been chosen by the weapon to pave the way for humanity. The announcer spoke more animatedly than he had before, but at the same time, Mash realized that he sounded uncertain. It was like he didn't expect this from the person, which probably meant that fighter had only recently acquired the weapon. The announcer was being forced to adjust to the changes. The announcer was able to adapt quickly and continued his introduction. No opponent could truly challenge the hero, but we have prepared the best challenge we could manage. From the tall jungles of the south, we have brought a silver rank golden back crusher. Let us witness the demonstration of the hero's power. The gate containing the creature rose as the announcer finished his words. The creature moved out slowly at first, and Mash got a good look at the beast. Silver rank would mean it was over level 100, which was quite impressive. It stood as tall as the golem from earlier but was wildly different in appearance. The golem had been blocky and flat, but this creature bulged with thick muscles. Its large hands were as big as Red's hammer from earlier, and it had 4 of them. The creature didn't seem to have any legs and only possessed 4 arms. With dark brown fur covering its body, Mash could easily make out the glint of gold as it contrasted with the fur. Covering a large majority of its back rested a golden shell, that sparkled under the gentle light of the sun. The adventurer prepared for the fight, angling his blade towards the creature, ready to parry a blow. The monster seemed to take it as a provocation and launched itself forward. It didn't run or jump, it seemed to pound against the ground and throw itself with its muscular arms. The very air became a weapon for the creature as the force of its throw had propelled the air as well. He held out the sword, aiming it at the monster's body, and let out another pillar of flame. It shot forward thicker than it had been before. A loud pained roar could be heard from within the flame, the entire building shaking from the noise. The creature never appeared from the flame, only its shell remaining as the fire dissipated. It was a display much like his own fight, where the organizer had given the adventurer an opponent who was woefully unable to do anything. Despite that, Mash's full attention was on the hero, everyone's gaze fell upon the weapon in their hands. To some extent, everyone in the audience was hoping the person would die, that they would have the opportunity to claim the weapon for themselves. Despite knowing that the weapon chose its owner somehow, Mash felt the same temptation as the others. It wouldn't do anything to synergize with his skills or abilities, but it wouldn't matter with a weapon like that. No, its power was simple, and anyone could find a use for it, especially since it would likely supersede any skill they possessed. Everyone's focus was on the platform, long after the hero had disappeared beneath it. Mash winced as he saw Jill rise, to the stares of the entire stadium. He felt bad as she probably didn't know what was going on and was left facing the greedy stares of everyone. His feeling of pity only grew as he realized that she would need to fight after the hero. Despite everyone's focus on her, no one actually looked like they were paying attention. Even his own gaze drew away from Jill, who seemed completely dumbfounded by the situation. We have another powerful contestant. A young prodigy of space magic, a follower of the mysterious Fae, and wielder of their many abilities. Will she be up to the challenge against the formidable hounds of the Shadow Forest? Mash watched as 3 wolves came out of the gates. They were partially covered in shadows, and he recognized them as the monsters they faced before. It meant that this fight would be easy for her, and he wasn't really worried about the outcome. Normally the wolves would be dangerous for a mage, so he understood why the organizers of the fights had chosen them as her opponent. However, much of the danger of these creatures came from a lack of knowledge or unpreparedness of fighting multiple opponents. That didn't apply to them as they knew of the creature's abilities and had been fighting multiple opponents for as long as they could remember. As expected, the fight was trivial for Jill. Teleporting behind the creatures, she teleported the entire group of wolves up into the air. Far higher than was necessary to kill them, and teleported herself back to the ground. The monsters yelled loudly as they fell to their deaths. Some people might recognize the power it took to teleport unwilling creatures, but most would just think that the Coliseum had failed in preparing an adequate fight for Jill. While that was true, it did not take away from what Jill had done. In order to teleport a creature against her will, she would need to overpower its resistance. Both from the mana the creatures had, and their individual wills. Still, she easily crushed them and finished the 3 creatures in a single move. The quick fight had not done anything to make her known and only made people remember the hero from before. She was overshadowed by the previous fight, and he expected Red and Luke to be similarly forgotten. Well, maybe not Luke, as he was basically a hero incarnate. Red though would become a mere preamble to the hero. Honestly, the thought made Mash a little grateful to the hero. He had been increasingly worried about the fame his group was building and was relieved to see that Jill's fight went by unnoticed. Who knows, maybe they would even forget about Luke. That made the hero's fight a blessing in disguise for them, but Mash kept his mouth shut as he looked over his friends. He didn't think they would like to hear that their fights would likely be ignored. Jill teleported into their room, clearly unsatisfied with the outcome of the fight. She had won but had not accomplished half of what she wanted. Mash didn't stick around and listen to her complain, instead of heading down for his fight. He moved quickly, somewhat hoping that he would catch the hero leaving. He wasn't so lucky, the man or women being long gone by the time he arrived at the fighter's entrance. The attendant from before was there, and she told him to wait for the current fight to end. Mash hadn't paid the slightest attention to who was fighting before him and didn't really care. He wanted to finish his fight quickly since there would be nothing he could do to compete with the hero from earlier. It may have been careless to think the fight would be easy, but he hadn't displayed much of his strength earlier, so he didn't think that the fight organizer could prepare something adequate. The next fighter descended the ramp, the attendant walking them back casually. He was a slightly older man, who proudly wore several badges on his clothing. It was a simple armor that had metal plates separated by leather along the joints. It didn't cover him completely, only providing him a little more protection around his vitals. It was covered in tiny scratches too, but Mash didn't think many were from his fight today. The man seemed unblemished, likely having ended his fight easily. Mash got an idea for how the Coliseum operated now. The first fight a person had was merely used to gauge the power of the challenger, and only the preceding fights had any real challenge associated with them. It was probably why they made a person sign up for several fights, rather than just one at a time. So, he wasn't worried much about his fight since he only displayed the type of magic he possessed. His thoughts were disrupted as the attendant told him to follow her, and he walked down the familiar ramp. This time he had arrived a bit late, as he missed his introduction. However, he did manage to catch the end of the announcer's words pertaining to the monsters. The announcer had called them fire ants, which actually caused Mash to feel a little relieved. It was one of the things that Jack had told them about yesterday, and Mash could recall some of what he knew. They were monsters that were weak individually, and usually only fought in large hordes. Their bodies would coat in flames, and they could even launch balls of fire from their abdomens. Mash wasn't overly worried about a few insects. Sure, the matchup wasn't great for Mash, but it wasn't particularly bad either. Fire didn't counter wood as many might believe. Instead, it added to its danger. It would essentially just make all of his wooden creations into burning weapons of flame. He guessed that the fire wouldn't do much damage to the ants, but they would still die from the wood, nonetheless. The only real problem it created for Mash was restricting his use of his armor. So, he let the armor fall apart as he rose to the stadium, knowing that it wouldn't do him much good. As he entered the arena, he realized what the organizers had planned for him. Each gate was bursting with ants, and he could hear their rumbling and clicking from where he stood. There were easily over 100 of the monsters visible to him, and he guessed that there might even be more than that beyond the gates. He was impressed by the sheer number of monsters the Coliseum possessed, and guessed they had a method of breeding them. Perhaps, they captured a queen and were sending its children after him. Alternatively, they might be sending one of the ant queens at him, but he doubted they would waste such a valuable monster on a fight. As he looked over the monsters he remembered more what Jack had said. The ants were a swarm-type monster like the rats from his first mission, so their levels weren't particularly high, and he guessed that most ants would be a lower level than himself. They were trying to overwhelm him, to swarm him with a plethora of monsters. They probably assumed that he was the type of mage that used his mana quickly and was planning on exhausting his resources. He couldn't contain his laughter anymore and let it out freely. It echoed from beneath his mask, but he just let it grow louder. Priscilla shared in his excitement, realizing what this fight would mean for them. In their foolish attempts to give him a real challenge, they had instead given him a small army worth of level UPS. He knew that he probably looked crazy to the audience, laughing as the gates rose to let the monsters flood towards him. As the ground trembled from their marching, Mash couldn't stop himself though and continued the laughter as wooden replicas Priscilla formed from his back as though he were a 100-tailed beast. For his part, he started his motions, swinging his sword staff about him in his usual style to take advantage of persist. He continued laughing as his energy drained, as the ants grew closer, and the carnage could begin in all its glory. Chapter 75, Levels of Carnage. There were a lot of ants. Mash noticed this as he killed them in groups of 5 or 6 with each attack. Several of the wooden replicas of Priscilla had begun eating the ants like a snake. The sound of carapace crunching was heard through the stadium, filling the arena with the sickening breaking noise. His creations could manage it easily, and at their current size were swallowing 2 or 3 ants at a time. The fighting in the distance was easy since once his creations caught on fire the ants didn't really have much more they could do them. It's not like they could be on fire more. At some point though, Priscilla would tell Mash that one of his creations was unstable and to break it off and start forming another. This was the most annoying aspect of the fight since he was constantly forced to replace his weapon, and the other creations, as they took a lot of damage during his attacks. It was just another thing that drew some of his and Priscilla's concentration. He believed that Priscilla could handle herself but was worried about his own condition. Though it was growing easier as his stats improved. The longer this fight the better he would be, and he was hoping that Persist would buff him soon. Mash found it surprisingly easy to follow her instructions, despite the up-close fighting he needed to focus on. She would form all the pathways for his energy, and all he needed to do was fill them in. It was still slower than if it was the only thing he needed to focus on, but the fighting at melee range was growing more dangerous. Once the ants got close, they lit their entire bodies aflame and threw themselves at him. Mash only realized it was a suicidal attack when he cut one of the burning bodies in two and felt nothing. He was also surprised at how weak their outer shell really was. It cut apart with little effort, and it was clear that it was not meant for defense. These creatures were not meant to survive a hostile encounter, but to die and take their opponent down with them. Their only real attack was a suicidal rush, and not one had shot the ball of fire that Jack had mentioned. That probably meant that they were not the exact same monster. Their suicidal nature was annoying though. Normally, killing a monster would give someone a slight feeling of energy or power, indicating that they were progressing towards a level. Some of the kills he was getting told him it was too late. Not many of the kills ended that way though, as he focused on killing the ants that lit a flame first. He essentially was aiming to kill them while they were in the process of killing themselves. It was a bit strange to think about and increased the danger a bit, but it wasn't anything he couldn't handle. That didn't mean that he didn't get burned, the sheer heat they gave off had reddened his skin, thankfully his clothes weren't completely burned through. He was wearing a type of training clothes that were less likely to burn off. Though catching on fire might be the end of them. It had almost happened a few times too, though his constant movement had killed the flames before they could spread. So, the fight continued like this, and he had sustained his fair share of burns. He didn't have the time or focus to care about that though, as Priscilla would warn him if things ever got too dire. For now, he spun among the ants, cutting those he could up close, and decimating their horde from afar. If nothing else, this fight had been a prime example of what he had been trying to achieve with Priscilla thus far, and they still hadn't perfected it yet. The other surprising thing he noticed, was the slight anti-synergy of skills. As his carnivorous tree skill gained him stats, it took longer for his persist buffs to trigger. When he was able to devour so many creatures with each attack, his carnivorous tree skill was noticeably increasing his stats, and while it did make him faster and stronger, he was recovering a lot of energy from the skill. Unconsciously, Mash had come to rely on persist for battles like this and had expected the skill to kick in by now. While his stat gains from the carnivorous tree skill were becoming big, they were still small when compared to the jump he felt with persist. Priscilla, hold off on eating, just kill until persist kicks in. Giving Priscilla the command was easy enough, though it took a while for her to respond. As he heard her response, he was surprised to feel like she was putting a considerable amount of effort in. He figured it was easy for her to make the pathways, but it seemed like he had been wrong about that. She adjusted quickly to the command though, and he felt the steady improvement he had been feeling stop. The sudden lack of incoming energy had been more detrimental than he expected. He stumbled when it happened, almost falling into an ant, but managed to stop himself by turning it into a shoulder tackle. He collided with the flaming ant that he planned on splitting in two and bounced off it, returning to his motions. He didn't immediately notice the burning on his clothes, but Priscilla did, and she actually tore his shirt off, ripping it along the sides so that it would fall away. It did fall away, but not before he felt a scathing pain from the burning of his skin, the smell not making it any better. The smell of the battlefield was already unpleasant from the plethora of burning ant corpses, but somehow his own skin burning smelled even worse. There was another problem with this, one he hadn't considered until it happened. His skin was marred with long black mana scars, and patches of black scales as if some had used it to replace wounded skin. Simply, he looked like a monster and was no longer able to hide his appearance. The strangest thing about this was the lack of care he felt. In a fight, in a moment like this, he could forget the perception of others. Priscilla's encouragement for carnage felt easier to accept, his own monstrous side felt more right. He was a human, but not when he fought. Then he was something else, not a monster but something not human either. He was simply what he was. There was a joy in accepting that. He probably would have removed his mask if he remembered it, but he was too absorbed by the fight. Consumed by the thrill, the rush of gaining levels had happened several times. He didn't know how much time had actually passed, but he felt a new kind of power envelope him. Finally, persist kicked in, and the buffs caused his abilities to expand, to double. Priscilla took advantage of that first, making him enlarge the creations further, each becoming as large as she had been during the dungeon. There was a difference though, with over 20 of the creations rampaging in the surrounding, crushing groups of ants against the floor and walls. Priscilla had also started devouring ants again, and he felt his stats start to rise. For his part, Mash took advantage of his improved speed and reflexes, more easily able to kill the nearby ants. The biggest benefit of the improved stats was the greater toughness his body got, making the fires less harmful, and dodging more effectively. The other thing he noticed, much to his happiness and surprise, was the dulling of pain he felt. He was now gaining more health than he lost, and the pain he felt was reflecting that. He kept going, another level up encouraging him to do more. He continued to fight like a vagabond, without a shirt and laughing as the adrenaline from the fight made it harder to contain himself. Something changed though, and he found his laughter dying. The fight was becoming easy, the challenge fading as he grew stronger. The ants' numbers were dwindling, but there was still a lot. The problem was with him, his stats had become too high, and these weak opponents became nothing more than simple ants. At the start, they were monsters who could inflict serious harm and even possibly kill him, but now they were mere insects. Each swing of his weapon would kill a group of them, each of his creations was unstoppable at this point. He knew from this fight that he was strongest against a plethora of weaker enemies, but that wasn't actually something that he wanted. By the time the fight came to an end, he was pleased with his levels but disappointed with the fight. What did he expect would happen if his stats kept rising? He didn't know, but no fights had changed this much. This had been a complete shift, from a challenge to a bore. He wondered if his future fights would be like this but hoped that it would only be the case against these types of monsters. He made sure to kill the last ant while he stood on the platform, telling Priscilla to make sure he stayed standing. She did it by using some of his creations to be ready to prop up his body. It was only then that he realizes the number of tails he had attached to him. He must have looked truly freakish as 20 tails of wood sprouted from his back. They grew in thickness and size the further they were from his body and scanned the battlefield as he came to a stop atop the platform. It was a mess, the floor and walls covered in ant viscera and cracked from his attacks. The arena was ruined with damage, and he could only vaguely hear the announcer's commentary as the fight came to an end. Most of his creations had stopped moving by now and were laying across the battlefield as enormous logs and sculptures. Several were burning, but most only had some scorch marks on them. Mash only looked towards the crowd once he killed the final ant and stopped moving, having made it fully onto the platform. He was only able to catch a glimpse of their faces as he fell into unconsciousness. Some of them he recognized as they matched the looks of those that watched him when he was a child. The look of fear that he had mistakenly thought was disgust. There was another set of faces that surprised him even more than the fear, a look of acknowledgement, of awe. There were far fewer with that look in their eyes, but they were there. It filled Mash with pride, with a burning desire to maintain his consciousness, to keep up the image that those few saw in him. The fear he was familiar with, the awe and respect was something he craved. He didn't think it was something that would ever be directed at him, but he saw that it was possible. It was then at this moment, that he found the strength to remove his mask. To let it fall to the floor and let them see his face as he descended from the battlefield. Mash had unconsciously kept the mask on, knowing that it would be a bad idea to remove it, but felt the urge to take it off now. It had hidden his face and more specifically his eyes. Those he knew were the most jarring part of his transformation, even more, the inhuman scales marring parts of his body. His eyes had always scared people, even when they weren't monster-like. Now, they were practically a weapon in themselves, a way to intimidate his opponents. So, he kept it hidden, knowing that one day it would probably be revealed. Looking at those few faces, he decided that they deserved to see him for what he was and let them meet his unnatural eyes, as he forced himself to keep them open. They would know him for what and who he was. He did do one last thing before losing himself, and he grinned as he checked his status. Even though he was only able to see his level before, losing to the darkness of unconsciousness. He thought that he managed to maintain his consciousness until he fell out of the view of the audience. Name, Mash Class, Scale Wood Devourer. Level, 4147. Chapter 76, The Once Dead Stat. Mash opened his eyes and was only slightly startled by the sight that he saw. He was propped up against one of the walls by the rising platform, and he could see his mask laying by his leg. Only vaguely remembering taking it off, he was unsure of whether he should wear it again or not. It would be pretty pointless considering he had just revealed his face to the masses. And he knew that news would spread quickly in this place. It had for everything else, and he guessed that this would be no different. His thoughts on what to do about the mask were interrupted, as he noticed Luna. Well, he didn't exactly notice her so much as she made herself known by waving her hand in front of his face. With a quick glance around, he realized that Jill and Alex were there as well. Alex had her same stoic expression, but she didn't glare at Mash now, and he guessed that the fight changed her opinion of him a little. On the other hand, Jill was similarly sitting on the ground and only managed to sit up using the wall as support. It was clear that she was drained, likely from all the teleporting she did. Looking over their group, he knew what had happened. After his fight, Luna had probably grown extremely worried and forced Jill to teleport her down here. He knew that was probably the case, as he felt no pain from his body, and could see no burns across his arms or chest. Alex probably came along because of Luna, and Jill was made to act as the carrier for both of them. Feeling slightly bad for Jill, he thanked her as best as he could. He couldn't get any words out though and began coughing roughly. On top of the cough, he realized just how dry his throat felt. In fact, it kind of felt like his lungs were dry too. He knew that he had breathed in a lot of hot air during the fight, and guessed that his lungs wouldn't get out free of damage, but the dryness he felt was startling. All Luna's healing did was treat the physical injuries he had, but not actually restore his saliva, for that he needed water and time. Deciding he couldn't speak yet, he opened his storage space and pulled out his water flask. He had purchased this recently, after having seen Jack use it during training. It was an interesting device that could keep water somewhat chilled for a fairly long period of time. Taking in a large mouthful of water, he spat it up as he got into another coughing fit. That had been a bad idea as his coughs this time were worse, and he made a mess of his pants with the water. Apparently, he wasn't ready to start drinking that much water and took a much smaller sip. It was an odd experience of feeling both good and bad. The chilled water felt good in his mouth but felt like it was scratching his throat as he swallowed it. Seeing the worried faces of Luna and Jill, he knew he would need to give them an update. "I'm fine, my throat was just very dry." Even that small sentence felt uncomfortable as it left his lips, but he managed to persevere through it. They only relaxed slightly but seemed to understand. With the relaxation came Luna's fury, as her face contorted with rage. How could they do a fight like that? There were hundreds, maybe even over 1,000 of the monsters. You could have died, and end. She trailed off, needing to pause and take a breath as she yelled at the Coliseum organizers. Although he didn't pay much attention to what she had to say next, as he got caught up by what she just said. Close to or over 1,000 ants, that was more than he expected. How many levels had he gotten again? He remembered checking, but couldn't remember the number, and decided that he needed to know. Focusing inward, he felt the usual rush of information enter his mind. Name, MASH class, Scale Wood Devourer. Level, 41-47. Health, 1000/1100. Energy, 1780/2000. Fortitude, 100 plus 10 110. Endurance, 7174 plus 680. Strength, 7172 plus 375. Agility, 72 plus 375. Intelligence, 107 plus 13 120. Wisdom, 6869. Charisma, 3563. Free stats, 5350. Skills, Persist, Monowood Creation, Inhuman Hibernation, Mana Territory, Unnatural Monster Core, Inhumanity, Wooden Body, Carnivorous Tree. Mana Territory, passive. Your eyes just weren't enough. Sense the changes in the mana around you. Connect to the mana in your space and inherently understand the nature of the mana. Current range, 11 feet 13 feet. Seeing his levels and free stats, he quickly raised them. He raised them across the board, but also made sure to raise his intelligence and fortitude the most because they weren't rising normally anymore. It seemed like 100 was a threshold and raising stats through training slowed down significantly after that. He didn't mind much, as the initial boost he received from the fight had been insane. His charisma had almost doubled from the fight, or at least since he last checked his status, but that kind of improvement was unheard of. Especially, if he assumed the changes came solely from this fight. What did the stat even do? He read up on it before, and it sounded like it had no tangible benefits, but he knew that wasn't true anymore. Charisma worked to both improve a person's own charm, strengthening both their allure and intimidation. Essentially, a person with high charisma was usually both loved and feared. Mash believed he filled the latter, but what about the former? He didn't think he was very much loved for his appearance or personality. Or did it relate more to his opinion of himself? That would be strange though, since it would mean that someone could raise their charisma simply by being self-gratifying. No, it had to be something else, and he figured he would never understand the stat properly. He was curious to see what the effect would be like and wanted to try exploring the city without his mask on. Maybe he could try it later tonight. For now, he would go home with the others. As he began to push himself up against the wall, he felt an arm grab his shoulder to support him. Jill had reacted quickly and gave him a grin before speaking. "Well, what level are you now?" He could hear the anticipation in her voice, and he didn't keep her waiting, excited to brag a little. "Level 47. 6 whole levels from the fight." "Hey, I honestly expected more. The genuine disappointment in her voice surprised Mash, and he considered her words more carefully. As he thought about it, he found that he agreed with her. He had killed around 1,000 of the ants and figured it should have given him more levels. Knowing that gaining levels were related to danger, he guessed that he gained far fewer levels as the fight progressed. You started gaining nothing at some point. Priscilla added the message, confirming what he had realized already. Still, he was glad for the reassurance, and this also made him realize why high-level people didn't just kill hordes of lesser monsters or people. It was reassuring to know the class system wouldn't encourage the genocides of weaker people. He knew it didn't happen, and could probably find this reasoning somewhere, but it felt different to confirm it for himself. He told Jill as much as he knew, and she seemed a bit disappointed at his words, but ended up agreeing with his deductions. She understood that while it made it so there was no really easy way to level, it was better this way. As he found his footing, they walked out of the tunnel. He had changed into his mending clothes and wore his mask but knew that it wouldn't change much. It was already easy to recognize him, and nothing would change now. As he passed the entrance, he was unsurprised to see the others waiting for him. The attendant was looking starstruck but continued to stop them from entering. She seemed conflicted, debating whether to just ignore her orders and let Arthur through or continue to insist that he couldn't enter. When she noticed Mash, she looked more disappointed than relieved, knowing that Arthur wouldn't hang around. Mash joined the others but paid more attention to the crowd that surrounded the entrance. Their eyes met his mask, and many turned away, but a few looked on. Mash wondered who would end up the most famous after today. It was a real toss-up between him, the hero, and Luke. Honestly, Mash thought that Luke would still win, especially with the reverent gazes that continued to follow him. They made it home, not stopping anywhere as the watching eyes were rather intense. There was an even bigger commotion outside their place, and he didn't know what to think. He was glad that the princesses weren't with them, otherwise, they wouldn't be able to go into the mansion. The crowd parted and let them in, and Mash was a little surprised to notice that most of the people weren't noble. When he first arrived, there were a handful of nobles, but now over half the crowd seemed to be commoners. Once he got inside, the most important thing he wanted to do was eat a meal. After which, the sun would be down, and he would be more comfortable walking around without his mask on. The butler had dinner prepared before they got back, and they had a quick meal. Mash ate quickly, finding himself extraordinarily hungry. He didn't pay much attention to the food, focusing on getting it into his body over tasting it. All the food the cook prepared was good, so he held little back as he devoured as much as he could. Stepping out again, Mash looked towards the gate and saw that it was still crowded. The next best option was hopping over the wall. That was what he ended up doing, feeling awkward as he leaped over the small wall. It was slightly smaller than him, so he could clear it easily. He pushed off the top with his hand, the gesture unnecessary, but it felt more natural that way. The streets directly behind the house were not busy, and he made his way towards the central portion of town. There were two things he noticed as he walked down a dimly lit street in the market district. First, he was shocked to see that almost every shop was still open. Every single one had lights pouring out of their windows, several dozen stalls lined each corner. The other thing that surprised him was the number of children that were wandering about. At his old home, children were usually kept inside at night, and it was mostly meant for the adults. It seemed like this town was almost the opposite of that. Although he had seen children during the day, they seemed much more free now, running through the streets and between the shops like they owned the night. A strong smell of sugary and oily food wafted through the air, and he wondered if this place was meant for children. That thought was dashed as he noticed several groups of drunk adults, playing around in some of the more open spaces. Out of curiosity more than anything else, he walked towards one of the groups of children. They looked no older than 6 or 7, but that wasn't the reason he picked them out. The reason he noticed these kids, in particular, was the unafraid gleam in their eyes. Well, that wasn't true of the whole group, but the central 3 kids looked at him without flinching, even after he met their eyes. When he got closer to the group, the boy in the middle reacted. "You're the one from the arena. The Ant Slayer." The boy was rounder, clearly having stuffed his face with the pastries that were being sold. There was a pile of empty skewers and wrappers, and Mash was tempted to buy himself some. The boy was mostly normal outside of that, his roundish features were well hidden by dirty blonde hair that grew in a messy pattern around his head. He had spoken confidently, and with no small bit of awe as he looked at Mash. Startled by the kid's reaction, he didn't know how to respond. How had kids been in the arena? From what he knew, it was strictly against the rules for anyone who had not received their first class. Well, putting that aside, for now, he looked over the group of 3 kids more carefully. All 3 wore rather poor clothing, and it was clear that they weren't very well off. One of the other kids was small, and he guessed that she was a year younger than the rest. Her eyes were large, and she looked at his face unblinkingly. It was a bit off-putting and creepy, as her eyes poked out through long black hair that poured down her face and back. Feeling uncomfortable, he turned towards the last kid and was surprised by what he noticed. Chapter 77, Mana and Dungeons. This kid was unique from the others, his talent being obvious to Mash. He was the skinniest of the group, seeming surprisingly bony despite holding several empty skewers in his own hands. Though what had startled Mash was the mana he could feel in the kid. There were only 2 real ways for a person to have mana. Either a dedicated class or doing training as he had done in the past. Judging from the kid's appearance, Mash guessed that it was the former. Scrutinizing the kid more, Mash noticed what he had missed earlier. His ears were narrower than normal, but not as long as an elf's ears. At first, Mash thought that he might be a half-elf, but realized that his ears were cut. The shortness was not because of his race. Mash considered what to do and chose to ask the kids about something else to give himself some time to think. What's going on? Why is everyone out tonight? When he first saw the streets, Mash thought it was a typical event, but the crowds had clearly looked like they were celebrating something. He guessed it was a festival but didn't know for what. The kid who spoke earlier replied to his question. It's for the heroes, there's 2 more now. Mash could see what he meant now, realizing that today was a significant moment for the city. It seemed like his fight was going to lose out to Luke's and the other hero, considering the literal festival that was being thrown in their honor. Thinking about it, Luke would probably be excited to see the celebrations. Plus, it would hopefully improve his mood since he looked like he was struggling. He was going to reply, and brag about knowing one of them, but stopped when the little girl spoke. Yeah, but you're stronger, right? She never took her eyes off his. The stare was already creepy before, but now it was entering the realm of disturbing. The other thing her words made him realize, that it was likely that all 3 of the children had been in the arena during yesterday's events. Rather than going back immediately, he spent a few minutes talking to the kids, learning of their situation. He talked a little about his abilities, and their classes, learning some interesting information. All 3 possessed rare classes, which was especially interesting considering their age. They talked about them excitedly, choosing not to hide anything about their skills either. The elven child with the abundant mana actually had a class called Mana Touched, which granted him a skill to passively increase his mana beyond its limit. The interesting thing about his skill was that it simply grew past his maximum, while the actual max remained unchanged. It sounded powerful, and powerful beyond what a child should get. The girl who stared at him awkwardly, had a much more problematic class, one that told him that he would need to take them to his brother. She had the mutant class, and the skill she gained was changeable, which made her body more susceptible to change. The final boy had a class he knew about, but never heard of a child ever receiving it. He possessed the Sinner class, and it gave him a skill called Glutton, which made him immune to the negative effects of foods. From the skills and classes, Mash was building a rather horrific depiction of their situation. The elven child with the abundant mana was called Gills, the middle kid who acted as a leader was known as Bigby, and the little girl with the strange stare was Liz. He learned that the kids were from a nearby orphanage and took advantage of the festival to eat some sweets. Apparently, the entire group was adept at sneaking out and did likewise frequently. They talked about random things, and they seemed to enjoy speaking to Mash. They kept asking him about how he fought, and he enjoyed bragging to the children. Mash avoided the topic of Gil's ears as they were not something he knew how to deal with. He felt like it was wrong though and figured his brother would want to know. Mash managed to convince the kids to follow him, by offering the ability to meet with his brother and Luke. They seemed very interested at that, although Bigby was the only one who spoke. Liz just kept staring at him, and he scratched the back of his neck as he led them back to the house. These were some strange children, and he was essentially kidnapping them. He sighed at the thought as he noticed several people giving him weird looks, but they turned away when they met his inhuman eyes. Instead of worrying about that, he focused on how he would explain this to his siblings but couldn't think of any way to avoid a lecture. Within his mana territory, he could tell that the kids were whispering about something but continued to follow him anyways. Wondering what they thought was pointless. His mental stats were high enough now that he was smarter than most adults, even if he was a little immature, but that didn't mean he had any chance of understanding the kids. Their situation was beyond anything he could relate to, and that was not even considering their strange conditions. At first, he wasn't all that suspicious of their situation, but after seeing the kids' ears, and the girl's oddness, he decided that something was probably wrong with their orphanage. Encounters like this reminded him of the World Carrier's words, and the chaotic fate he predicted for MASH. It seemed like MASH was destined for some event or another every time he went out, and he couldn't bring himself to ignore them as others might have. That was the difference, he realized. Most people would ignore a group of strange children, or avoid random situations that presented to them, but he could never do that. It just felt wrong, and he wondered if that was his own thoughts or some influence that was placed on him. Priscilla indicated that she felt no influence but mentioned that she couldn't be certain. He wasn't sure either but hoped that he wouldn't ignore interesting situations, otherwise that would make him a rather poor adventurer. As he thought about the things he had planned, he realized that he was very much living a life of chaos but didn't mind in the slightest and found himself sporting a grin at the thought. He made it to the back of the house, where he hopped over the wall earlier. This time he made a staircase so that the kids could follow him as well, but once they crossed into the yard, MASH was startled to see his brother and Alex with swords drawn. There were also several knights whom he hadn't seen before, all looking quite alarmed until they recognized MASH. "What's wrong?" Pulling his staircase over the wall, so that others couldn't use it, he asked his brother what the panic was about. Although from Arthur's exasperation, MASH had a pretty good guess and was quickly proven right. "The alarms triggered from you bringing in uninvited guests." His brother's tone was flat, but he didn't sound panicked as he looked over the kids MASH brought. He simply raised an eyebrow at MASH. It was enough, and MASH started explaining what had happened. It hadn't been more than an hour since he met the kids, but it took him a while to explain the story. His brother nodded along but didn't actually say anything. Soon Luna and his friends were also outside, and his sister began checking the children's condition. MASH didn't know what he had expected, but he was glad to relieve himself of the burden. It's not that he didn't want to know the rest of the story and investigate the orphanage, but he had too many things coming. For one, he wanted to do well in the tournament. He also needed to complete his fights with the arena, the last of which would only happen once he got to the next rank. That was the last part of the deal he made with the Coliseum. He would come back and display his new abilities here once he got to his next class. MASH didn't mind the deal but still wanted to accomplish the task quickly. In order to do that, he had planned on going to a dungeon the day after tomorrow. MASH brought up this idea with the others and they agreed that it would be a good idea. Rather than trying to clear the dungeon, they would simply kill monsters near the entrance. Some people did this, killing the same monster for years, but MASH wasn't planning on doing that. The main reason for that was the diminishing returns provided by killing the same monsters. Easier fights would be less likely to raise a person's level, but so would killing the same monster repeatedly. It was much easier and faster to level if you fought a wide variety of powerful monsters, but he would take what he could get while in the city. Despite all of this, MASH did move closer to be able to hear what the kids were saying as they talked about the orphanage. Although once he got close, the little girl went silent and continued to stare at him oddly. Knowing that he shouldn't feel so uncomfortable because of a kid's stare, he stood beside his brother to listen to the story. "Father said my ears wouldn't be good, and they needed to shorten them for me to get adopted." The words seemed to physically hurt Red, as her face contorted with rage. Luke looked equally displeased, and between the two of them were likely to burn the orphanage down. Jill seemed contemplative but asked something unexpected to the children. "Liz, was it? Why do you keep staring at MASH?" In the awkwardness of the stare, MASH had never bothered to actually ask why she was staring. He felt especially foolish as the girl seemed to be waiting for someone to ask. "He, smells like the candy Mother always gives me." She spoke excitedly, looking at MASH again as if she expected him to give her the candy. Unsure of what to do, MASH pulled out some candy. He had the butler purchase some and always kept some within his storage. He might not have wanted to waste the space, but he realized that his space had grown with either his levels or mana and took advantage of the added space. The next best choice was his sugar cubes but found that candy worked better for his snacking. The little girl excitedly snatched up the candy and popped it into her mouth without thinking. She didn't seem as excited though, and her face twisted in confusion. There were several things that bothered MASH about the face. The first of which was the ways her eyes seemed to gloss over when she first put the candy in her mouth. The other thing that stood out was the poor state of her teeth, and he realized that all the children had similarly damaged teeth. Unsure of what he did, Mash decided to just ask the child. Is something wrong with the candy? She shook her head vehemently as if he would take it away despite it being in her mouth. Mash was going to say more, to try and get her to relax, but stopped when she started to answer him. These candies don't tingle like the ones mother gives us. Mash felt he understood a little of what the girl was getting at, and a glance at Jill and his brother told him that they came to the same conclusion. They were probably feeding the children a drug of sorts, and the children were probably affected by it. It did much to explain the strangeness of the three children, but not why Liz said it smelled like him. He wasn't sure what to think but decided he would take an extra long bath. His siblings seemed content with taking care of the children for now, and Luna seemed like she would heal the three of them. It would deal with the physical problems, and he hoped that it could heal whatever the drugs did as well. Though, he saw the sadness in her eyes and guessed that she knew it wouldn't. Before going to take that shower, Mash asked what his brother was planning. Mash wanted to see the end of the story, even if it meant missing the training tomorrow. Especially, since his brother informed him that he would be visiting the orphanage tomorrow morning. Mash decided that he would follow him, unable to resist the temptation of his curiosity. Chapter 78, Creepy Orphanages. The night had gone slowly after getting the information out of the children. A few interesting discoveries were made as they spoke to the children. First, the orphanage was part of the outer city, which congregated against the walls but not within them. The second was that none of the children knew any of the names of the adults, only ever addressing them by occupation or title, like mother and father. The whole thing was rubbing him the wrong way, and he was lost in contemplation as he tried to sleep. It never really came, though he managed to shake off the feeling of drowsiness with his inhuman hibernation skill. It worked surprisingly well for keeping him awake, despite what the name might imply. They were planning on going with the sunrise, his brother having informed the orphanage of their visit. The reason he was going with was that they found the children running about late at night and decided that they would return them in the morning, due to the celebrations. Luke had been excited when he heard of the festivals but didn't really feel like attending. The situation with the children was weighing on all their thoughts last night, and celebration was the last thing on their minds. Mash was glad he brought the children to his brother because only his brother could let them in on the investigation. Normally, this kind of job would be something solely for the knights, but his brother didn't mind bending the rules a bit for him. Accepting that he wouldn't be getting any sleep tonight, Mash pushed himself out of bed. The blanket fell to the side, but Mash didn't bother picking it up. Typically, Mash would just leave his room a mess. It was a habit that he had ingrained as a kid. So, the blanket remained on the floor, and the servants would come in and make everything perfect anyway. He needed to do something, to move his body. For some reason seeing the children's situation felt more urgent than everything else. Knowing that the children were unable to do anything to get out of their situation, left the worst kind of taste in his mouth. His brother might be seeking out justice, but Mash just wanted to see the people get their due. Honestly, he knew that a part of them wanted a battle, a chance to kill them, or even just watch Arthur do it. Either way, he wanted them dead, not in prison. The thought might be wrong, and perhaps it was the influence of the class system, but at the moment, he didn't really care. It was not a feeling he disagreed with, even if he should. His sympathy would be saved for the future, for he just let the anger build. The emotions drove him to action, and he knew that he needed to cool down. Keep some semblance of calm and focus. Thinking that a bath might be good, he walked towards the biggest bathroom in the house. Ironically, it was the servants' bathhouse that held the largest bath since it was meant for groups of people to take baths at once. Walking through the empty halls always felt ominous, especially since the only light in the hallway was from the narrow gaps in the window curtains. The small bit of light that shone in the night filtered through the gaps and lit the hallway in sections. He strolled from one patch of light to the next, feeling more comfortable in the darkness than the light at that moment. It didn't take too long to get to the servants' portion of the house, and the bathhouse was indeed empty. He didn't know how long he planned on being in there and formed a sign to let the servants know he was there. The sign was heavily marred with black scales and scars and looked particularly ominous with the night. The bathroom wasn't nearly as dark as the rest of the house, a magical crystal lighting up as he entered the changing room. In the room were rows of small bins where someone would keep their clothing. Depositing his clothes in a bin meant for the purpose, he stepped into the actual bathroom. Inside he was pleased to see that the room was lit with more than just moonlight, the engravings on the walls and floor emitting a faint light. There weren't any traditional water crystals for cleaning oneself, instead of a simple tub of water that someone would scoop out a bucket for themselves. Mash felt more familiar with this style of bath and followed the motions he remembered from back home. His family hadn't gone to the public bathhouses often but did visit more frequently when the weather got particularly cold. It didn't take long, and he sank deeply into the wide bath. This larger bath was heated through mana, and he poured more than enough to get the water hot. In fact, he could see his skin reddening from the heat, but didn't mind the feeling. He didn't fall asleep but instead used the comfortable position to practice his old form of meditation. It was more a curiosity now, but it still felt good to move the mana in his core around. Priscilla found it interesting as well, since she was effectively part of his core now. Unknowingly the night had passed, and Mash got out of the bath when he heard noises from the changing room. It seemed like some of the servants had ignored his sign, though he didn't really care. He had put it up so that they could avoid him, not the other way around. Still, he took their arrival as his cue to get out and proceeded to exit the bath and dry himself off. When he entered the changing room, he saw several servants frozen at his entrance. Not bothering with a greeting, he simply changed into his mending clothes, before heading out. He sought out his brother, certain that he would be in the dining room or kitchen. In all his time here, his brother had never missed a meal, and Mash figured that he would find him at his usual spot. As expected, Arthur was at the dining room eating a simple breakfast. The strange part was the group of other knights sitting at the table. Entering the room, Mash could tell that his brother was the strongest person in the room. A few others were probably at the same rank as him, but most seemed to be closer to Mash. This made sense, considering his brother was getting close to the next rank. Mash took a seat at the table, trying his hardest to act as he belonged. The knights didn't seem to mind, though Mash felt the urge to squirm a little. No words were said during the meal, the plan was already decided last night. Instead, they just ate in silence as more people entered the dining room. Once everyone was ready, they headed out for the orphanage. Luna was staying with the children and had contacted some other healers to arrive to heal the children that were still in the orphanage. That was Jill's primary job since she was the only one with teleportation capabilities. There were 7 knights other than his brother, each was trained for missions within the city and would be good at handling any odd situations. One even had a class related to the investigation, but Mash didn't get to learn what it was called. Either way, he was feeling very confident with the mission. The streets were mostly empty with how early the mission began, but Mash still saw a few people walking among the streets. Though the majority of people seemed to be stumbling home, likely still dazed from the after effects of the festival. The signs of celebration were still littered across the street. Food wrappers, empty bottles, and articles of clothing lying about. He even saw some undergarments, both men and women's clothing lying about unattended. Festivals had happened back home, and he never remembered seeing the streets ever get this dirty. He was somewhat disgusted by the celebration, especially when he compared it to the situation of the children. So far, Mash had been enjoying his time in the capital. With meeting his family and the surprising amount of progress he was making, there was not much more he needed right now. While true freedom would be nice, it was not something he could achieve with his level of power. Plus, there were still the dungeons he was going to explore, each of which interested Mash. However, this one thing seemed so wrong to him that it stung like a bug's bite. How had the city leaders not known about this orphanage? No, Mash believed that they did know, but chose not to get involved because of some inane ideology. He didn't really care if there was some kind of reasoning behind the kids' treatment, because it wouldn't matter to him. In his mind, one of the worst things he experienced was being forced into a class, and he didn't like that it was happening to these kids. Their class shouldn't be so heavily corrupted and should be given as they deserved. His runner class had felt wrong when he received it, but now he wouldn't give it up for the world. His endure skill was by far his most valuable skill. A person's first class was meant for them, even if the system itself was not. They went through the town quickly, nobody stopping or idling about. They arrived early enough that the sun was still hidden, but late enough that the moon was also gone from sight. It was that in-between of darkness that enveloped the sky and the city. This ominous light did nothing to better his impression of the orphanage, and Mash stared at it trying to figure out what was bothering him. The building was several times larger than the other buildings of the external city. There was also an odd cleanliness about the building, as if the dirt of the city couldn't touch the building. It really looked like that too, as the bits of trash in the streets seemed to vanish as they neared the building. There were no walls to the building, instead, a shallow wooden fence of old brown wood was the only thing separating the building from the others. A yard of short grass surrounded the dark wood building that resembled an old church. The wood was dark and made even darker by the sunless skies, but none of that was what bothered him. One of the knights ended up pointing out the first oddity. There are no religious markings. The place was clearly an old church, but all the religious symbols one would normally find had been scratched out. He could barely make out what the patches were in the darkness, but after the knight pointed them out, he could make out the scratches much more easily. The empty patches of scratched out wood, where he would typically see a religious symbol, was jarring, to say the least. Although, his scan of the front of the building did more than illuminating that one thing. Not a single window in sight. Although that was not all he needed to say, but as he looked towards his brother, he felt that he should keep his mouth shut. However, his eyes still wandered to where a window might be in the building. He didn't know if it was a skill or just his natural instincts, but it felt like someone was watching him from there. Not that he could see anything but a scratched-out patch of wall. The feeling did make him anxious, and he grew more prepared to react quickly. Mash wore a very thin version of his wooden armor, beneath much baggier clothing, and had Priscilla start outlining some attacks. He didn't know if he would need them, but realized this would make a surprise attack much quicker. Like a true predator, he stood prepared to lash out at anything that jumped at them. Chapter 79, Into the Horror. The whole group didn't rush in, 3 of the knights didn't enter, manning the situation with locals instead. They were really meant to keep collateral to a minimum considering who was fighting inside. This was great for Mash, especially with his wide-range attacks. Although he would still need to hold himself back until the kids themselves were rescued. Proceeding carefully, they started to enter the orphanage, with no hesitation that the visit wasn't going to be peaceful. Mash was not the only one to notice the uncomfortable feeling of being watched. As soon as he passed the fence, the very air seemed to shift in Mash's eyes. It felt different, the house itself feeling even stranger. He couldn't quite place his finger on what was wrong, but several of the knights were resting their hands on their weapon's hilt. The biggest issue was that the strange feeling was familiar and was diverting much of Mash's attention to figure it out. It was like an itch he needed to scratch but couldn't reach. He ignored the feeling for now since they were approaching the main entrance. It was a set of double doors on a lightly raised wooden platform. A small set of steps lead up to it, and Mash was surprised to see that part of the building hang over the doors. His feet creaked against the wood beneath, and he felt that the building was very old. That thought only worried him more as he considered the state of the children. Still, he proceeded up the steps, each sound only firming his resolve. Even beneath the overhang, however, Mash continued to feel the stairs that followed them and shivered slightly at the feeling. But then, he felt something within his mana territory and shot his head upwards, trying to understand how they were watching him. What he saw was a face that was partially carved into the wood of the ceiling. Although, its proportions were completely inhuman, as overly large eyes looked down on him, from a face without a nose. It smiled when it met his eyes, the mouth growing so large and wide, that its smile actually cut into its eyes. The wood creaked as it happened, the dark wood contorting to let him see it in all of its horror. Mash shivered from the look the face gave him, the smile stuck in his memory like a tick. Mash almost attacked, but stopped himself, instead of alerting his brother of the face. When he moved to show his brother, the face melted into the wood, leaving behind a small trail of contortion. It was not a pleasant look, and Mash felt like he kept seeing the strange face from the corner of his vision. He knew that didn't make sense because he would sense it with his skill if that was the case. His brother clearly trusted Mash though and had told the knights to keep an eye out. After which, his brother pushed the doors open, and was clearly surprised to find them unlocked. Mash regretted stepping in, as his feeling of danger was screaming at him when he heard a greeting from inside. "Welcome to the orphanage. Are you here looking to adopt or?" They spoke in unison and sounded quite pleasant, but he cut them off anyway. At first glance, Mash looked over the two carefully. They were by far the most nondescript humans he had ever seen. Simple robes for clothing, and each possessing identical long hair. The brownish hair hung behind them, running down the length of their back. Mash didn't give the women a second thought as Priscilla figured out what was going on. "This is a dungeon, they are not of your world." Immediately, Mash saw the prepared outline shift into an attack meant to rip the arms and legs of the people in front of him. Not hesitating in the slightest, he launched forward following through with Priscilla's guidelines. He cut off their greeting, aiming his attacks to kill the one further away, and incapacitate the one nearer to him. It somewhat worked, as his surprise attack did manage to decapitate the one further to the right. The closest one though reacted as the first blade plunged into its leg before swinging to try and cut them both off. It did try to counterattack, its arm morphed oddly as it held it towards him. Nothing happened though as Arthur, intercepted the arm, cutting it off and freezing the thing from the neck down. For his brother to react quickly meant that he started to move just after Mash did. Again, he was grateful for the trust his family put in him. Mash felt the rush of a level up from the first creature, which let him know that it had died. The system was surprisingly helpful in informing someone of that, and he was excited by the level up. It either meant he was close after the ants, or these things were a lot stronger when they weren't surprise attacked. Mash knew they weren't human now, as the decapitated head had left no trail of blood. In fact, as he stared at the neck, he realized that it seemed entirely inhuman. The shape and position of the bone were all wrong, not to mention that he saw no throat or veins. He wondered what the things were, only growing more curious as the other being crushed its own brain. Its head had bulged unnaturally, parts of its hair and an eye falling out as the bones in its skull contorted to crush the brain. A goop of flesh poured out of its mouth and ears, but still lacked any semblance of blood. Everyone was disgusted, and one of the knights, and all of his friends threw up from the sight. Mash managed to keep himself from throwing up, knowing that he has done more disgusting things, remembering some of the things he had eaten. His brother was eyeing him, obviously waiting for an explanation. Priscilla could tell they were not human, and that they were monsters. Like from a dungeon. Also, she said that this building is part of a dungeon. Mash replied unhesitatingly, knowing that he had acted solely on Priscilla's judgment. Ever since their connection grew, it was impossible for them to lie to one another, and their intentions always came across with the messages. So, he knew he could trust Priscilla, and attacked following her message. Even if she was wrong, all that would mean was that he killed two horrible people. That was something he could live with. Good, don't hesitate when she tells you then. It seems she is the most suited for identifying those things. Mash nodded at his brother's words, adopting the role of a soldier like his father had taught him. With that, Mash found himself standing in the front with his brother, ready to lash out at any targets. He had several bladed tails preformed, and all he would need to do was launch them at any target he felt within his mana territory. They did run into another two groups of adult monsters, each group contained 2 to 4 nondescript people. They showed no mercy in attacking when Mash did, and they were able to handle these things easily enough. The bigger issue for Mash was that he was able to catch the strange face a few more times, its smile having grown so big it split its eyes in half. Each of the eyes moved to follow his movements, but he ignored them as they proceeded. It wasn't hard to know where to go as they could feel the unnatural aura emanating from below. So, they walked down a hallway, clearing each room as they headed to where the staircase would be. As Arthur opened the next door, Mash did hesitate with his attack. It was a childlike creature this time, and he hesitated as he thought about how dungeons were really just portals to other worlds. It was one thing to kill adults who were experimenting on children, but to ruthlessly kill children felt wrong. The mistake had cost him, and even though he managed to parry the blow slightly, it still cut into his side. The child's arm had grown rapidly, launching forward with bladed fingertips. His brother reacted quickly, killing the childlike monster, but Mash had already been hit. At first, he thought it would be fine, but the pain quickly intensified as it felt like his whole body was twisting around the injury. The pain he felt as his organs and ribs bent, caused him to fall to the ground. He screamed for Red or Luke and managed to look towards Arthur before shutting his eyes from the pain. Even curled into a ball, his brother knew what to do and pushed Mash up to his feet as he cut off the section of his side. Smashed organs and broken bones fell along with the flesh, and Mash clenched his teeth as blood filled his mouth. Mash only had a moment to worry about his life, before his friends came to his aid. Luke and Red moved quickly, starting to heal the wound immediately. Their soothing magic dealt with the pain first, and compounded the effects of his earrings. Finally, feeling the pain subside, Mash checked his condition with Priscilla and found that she had taken part of the pain herself. She had shared in his suffering and partially lessened what he experienced. Knowing what he experienced was only half the pain, he realized just how dangerous these things were. That also explained how he had gained 2 levels since entering the dungeon and was certain his friends were experiencing similar rewards. Arthur sent one of the knights to call for higher rank reinforcements. He had tried to get Mash and his group to leave as well, but Mash refused. Not because he was eager to fight to the death, or for the levels, but because he wanted to see this through to the end. His brother only agreed because he was worried about the time. Whoever ran this place knew that they were there, and he was worried that they might start killing the children to hide whatever was happening here. Mash worried for Luna, who was with the children, but remembered that Alex was one of the highest level people he had ever met, and she had called for more support from the church. Luna would be fine, he needed to focus on the present situation. They moved more quickly now, killing monsters without any hesitation. Mash was designated as the one to deal with the childlike monsters since he was the only one who could confidently know that they weren't human. Arthur dealt with the adults, and Jill helped him with her magic. With this formation, none of them hesitated and plowed through groups of the things as they made their way to the staircase. The first group went down quickly, as Mash cut through most of them with a wide-range attack. He was venting his anger a bit and didn't mind being a little ruthless. These disgusting things were experimenting on children. The thought kept his rage fueled, as he killed monster after monster. It took several minutes to get there, but once they made it, they realized something was odd about the descending staircase. Mash unconsciously started looking around for the face and found it looking back at him. The smile had opened now and he could see the lines for its teeth engraved into the wood. They were jagged and misshaped, and there were far more than he would see on a normal human. It made him shiver as it seemed to enjoy letting Mash find it. Pushing the thing out of his mind, he focused on the staircase. It was long, but the light cut off unusually as he stared further into the darkness. Mash recognized the sight and grew even more confused. Chapter 80, A New Dungeon. It's a dungeon entrance. Jill spoke up, despite everyone already realizing the situation. Despite knowing, everyone stared at Jill anyways. Mash had to ignore the face in the wood as he did so. It seemed to be trying to meet his eyes now, and it bothered him. As he caught a glimpse, he lashed out with an attack, though it did nothing to face, just hitting the wood while the face vanished from sight. The others were now staring at him, and Mash shrugged his shoulders while giving them an explanation. It's the thing I saw earlier, I think it's messing with me. I also think it might be upstairs, instead of down. This was the other interesting aspect of the staircase. It led up and down, and whereas the path downwards was hidden by shadowy darkness, the opposite path was shielded by a bright light. It felt like a dungeon entrance as well, but it was also different. Mash was uncertain about where to go, but it was clear the face wanted him to follow it. His instincts were telling him to do the same, but those always seemed to put him in more dangerous situations, even if they did usually benefit him. His brother seemed to be contemplating something as well but ultimately came to a decision. We are going to split up. I believe that you should stick together and explore the upper floors, while we will head beneath. Arthur's words surprised Mash because he assumed that he would want to protect them. However, it seemed that he was in sentinel mode, and figured that this would be the most effective way to save the kids. He said as much as he continued. You are all familiar with one another and have powerful healing capabilities to boot. If you find the children, teleport them out, and heal them once you can. Clearing the dungeon is not a priority, and you should not attempt to do so unless absolutely necessary. They nodded along and headed towards the staircase. His brother stopped Mash, handing him a familiar exit key. This confused Mash. Not the item itself, he understood why he received it, but the fact that his brother had dungeon keys at all. Normally, only adventurers could enter dungeons, unless there were circumstances like these. Why did his brother have the item? That was a question for later though, and he followed the others as they stepped into the light. The transition felt different than the other dungeons, the biggest of which was that he didn't really feel like he had teleported. It was as if the portal was merely a decoration. Although one look around told him that wasn't true. It was a long jail, rows of cells adorned 4 different floors, and Mash heard cries and wails from some, but most were silent. Mash was going to approach one of the cells, but felt something enter his mana territory from above, and yelled towards his friends. Dodge! Even as the word left his mouth he jumped forward, launching a counterattack upwards. The sound of clattering metal could be heard behind him, but he didn't hear any screams from his friends. He didn't need to hide his abilities in here, and Priscilla knew, guiding him to use lightning instead of his wood. He held his hand upward, knowing that the power of this attack would be lower than what his wood could manage. Although his goal wasn't power here, but speed and a distraction. The attack did more than that though, as lightning branched into the dark ceiling above, illuminating the monsters before striking them. They were abominations of human and spider parts, that walked across the ceiling and were connected to cages by long chains, that attached like a spider's web might. The cages were what they dropped on them. The lightning hit each of them, drawn to the metal chains that were connected to their bodies. The lightning surged into their bodies, stunning them and causing them to fall. 2 had died from the fall, skewering themselves on their own cages. The other 3 landed twirling in the air. They managed the motion by flattening their arms into narrow lengths of flesh that allowed them to turn in the air. It didn't matter though, as the others were prepared and attacked the creatures. Despite their stealth and adaptability, it seemed like their defenses were rather weak. Between the three others, they managed to kill the monsters before they could attack again. Mash moved closer to the two skewered ones. He felt the rush of a level as they died, but wasn't sure if it was true. The creatures' bodies were twitching rapidly, and Mash hoped that it was their death throes. It did let Mash get a better look at the things though. One had a spider's body, but where the head would normally be, sprouted a human torso and all its accompanying limbs. The second was much more deformed and only had the neck and head of a human. They were disgustingly hairy, both the human and spider portions sprouting large patches of hair like some kind of mold. The way its spider-like legs scratched at the human head in a panic, revolted Mash. He almost threw up but resisted the urge. Mash only hoped that he would not have to use his carnivorous tree skill in this dungeon. Mash turned back to the exit but saw that a gate had fallen and sealed it shut. He hadn't seen it as it had been hidden behind the light of the entrance. "Jill, can you teleport through that?" She vanished for a second, but reappeared near the gate, not past it. She stumbled a bit as she reappeared as if the gate had pushed her back somehow. She tried once more but got the same result. Shaking her head, she turned to the group. "No, it pushes me back, like when I try and teleport to where someone is already standing." That meant that their only way out was either clearing the dungeon or using the key, but judging by the number of kids he could hear crying, he figured the key wouldn't be able to get all of them out. He would apologize to his brother later, but for now, he needed to find the keys and could guess who had them. Time to look for who ran the prison. First, though, he walked up to a nearby cell where he heard some crying from. Inside he saw a group of 3 children. 2 were human as far his senses could tell, but one was like those things from earlier. He or she was clearly incomplete, as patches of skin were torn and he could make out blood leaking from the spaces. It didn't take to genius to figure what was happening with these kids. It was this scene that finally got Mash to throw up, both from extreme rage and disgust. The reaction was strangely comforting to Mash. He actually felt something for the kids that he killed. Unlike before, there was a sharp feeling of disgust that got him to puke his breakfast on the floor beneath him. Was it his growing connection with Priscilla, or was it the earrings, or maybe the marks? It didn't matter what the cause was, but it was clear that something was pushing back against the changes the class system was forcing on him. He could feel something about his kills now, and the knowledge that he killed innocent children sickened him. It was worse than the wound from earlier. His stomach felt like it twisted more now than it had from the attack earlier. He had felt glad to level from killing them earlier, but now he regretted each one. It wasn't worth the levels. After he had nothing left to empty, all that was left for him was rage. Unhindered by anything else, it felt like his body was burning. The face that had trailed him, that had smiled and laughed at him, that was who he would direct his anger towards. He would find this thing that had done this and give it the one thing it deserved. A slow, painful death. The others seemed just as resolved as him, some even seeming more resolved than he was. Mash tried destroying the cell gates but found them to be too hard to break. Jill's teleportation worked, but she couldn't do it for every cell. She teleported Luke inside as well, seeing if he could heal the kid, but it didn't work. No, their best choice was to find and kill the warden and use its keys to free the prisoners. With a plan of action decided, the group headed to the obvious location of the warden. It was a big door, several times larger than any of the cell doors, and it connected to a room that spanned the entire back wall. Mash didn't have to see the freakish face to know that it was behind those doors. As stated at the doors in the distance, he realized that the prison was lit up. Why would the creature keep lights in here? The spider creatures had no eyes, and he doubted that the monster would need light to see. For the children and human prisoners? No, there was no reason for it to do that. Mash guessed that it was for him, some kind of sick taunt meant to get his attention. Whatever the monster thought, it was clearly enjoying the attention Mash was giving it. He was fine with that, it could enjoy whatever it wanted so long as he was able to kill it. Before proceeding though, the group took the opportunity to level. Each person got to level while the others watched for enemies. Mash went last, as he was the highest level and most perceptive of the group. The process only took a few seconds for each of them, but it didn't hurt to be diligent. When it was Mash's turn, he knew what to expect as he thought on his status, the information matching what he had counted. Name, Mash class, Scale Wood Devourer. Level, 4751. Health, 1240/1240. Energy, 2000/2000. Fortitude, 110 111 plus 13 124. Endurance, 80 82. Strength, 75 77 plus 380. Agility, 75 76 plus 480. Intelligence, 120. Wisdom, 69 71. Charisma, 63 65. Free stats, 0 Mash allocated his stats quickly. He decided not to raise his intelligence like he normally might, since it always took him a little time to adjust to the new range of his mana territory, so he focused on other improvements. He decided that the most important thing was his durability and used his free stats to improve his physical attributes. The surprising thing was the improvement he had across the board and wondered where that came from. He didn't know exactly but pushed back the concern for now and would worry about that later. The other thing that got his attention was the speed of leveling and his current level. This dungeon was probably considered to be a rank above, or there was some reason for the rapid leveling. Either way, he was quickly approaching the next rank. There would be a lot of problems with ranking up in here, but he might need to do it. Unless there weren't many monsters, he didn't know if he could prevent the level UPS. As he came back to himself, he saw that his friends were ready to move, and Mash quickly rose to meet them. As he pushed himself off the ground, he realized that the floor was made of metal too. The strange part was that it wasn't cold though and felt warm to his touch. It was odd, but he ignored it. A lot about this place was strange, and his friends were anxiously waiting for him. They walked quickly heading for the large room.